The world around you is pitch black. You blink, unsure if there is a blindfold over your eyes at first, or if you are really surrounded by complete darkness. A shiver creeps down your spine that's slick with sweat as you suddenly become aware of the chilled room and the ice-cold feeling of the metal chair against your naked bottom and thighs. Your hands are bound behind your back, and your arms, back, and legs are aching from the strain of being there for hours. But that isn't the worst of the pain in your body. Burn marks, not yet healed, pock your skin. But perhaps you'd be able to center yourself if you were the only one in the room. But you're not alone. You hear the moans, the cries, and the screams of several other young boys next to you, all strapped in the same position. The foam earplugs in your ears don't mask the noises nearly enough. You hear a louder scream, the scent of burning flesh. The electric cattle prod has singed the boy next to you. But before you can breathe a sigh of relief that the flesh that's burning isn't your own, you're grabbed by your hair and lifted off the metal chair, plunged into a tub of freezing water, then shocked in 6 places on your body before the pain is so great you lose count and your consciousness fades. Then, everything goes black. The torture techniques and experimentation similar to those conducted by Mengele and other members of the SS from the Holocaust were alive and well in Colonia Dignidad. When the coup led by Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratic government in 1973, the bonds between the colony and the government deepened. Each needed something from the other. Colonia Dignidad needed protection to do what it wanted, and Pinochet's military dictatorship needed a place to carry out unspeakable deeds against enemies of the state. An alliance was formed on the basis of a shared hatred and fear of communism. So long as Schaefer aided the government, Colonia Dignidad could operate virtually untouched, and Schaefer and his Nazi leaders were commissioned to do their dirty work for the Chilean government. Colonia Dignidad became the center of torture for Pinochet, where prisoners who Pinochet and the DINA secret police dubbed as enemies, many of whom were suspected communists among other labels, were kept and experiments conducted. Paul Schaefer and his leadership now was doing far more than feeding intelligence to Chile's government. They were carrying out acts on its behalf. Torture techniques were practiced and developed behind soundproofed walls in the bunkers. National chemists were brought into the compound to help produce chemical weapons, and weapons of war were copied and manufactured in factories on the property. Behind the walls of Dignidad, they were preparing for war. But the atrocities that took place were not only against the enemies of the military dictatorship. They were also against Schaefer's own flock, to keep them subdued, to keep them separated, and to keep a steady flow of boys for his own rape and abuse within his reach. Paul Schaefer set up his community so that everyone would share everything. An idealistic concept, except even in the enclave, families didn't exist. Instead, they were split up into groups by age and gender. Babies were taken from their mothers at birth and raised in a nursery. Boys and girls separated too, with the children unsure of who their parents and other siblings were. All adults in the community were either called uncle or aunt by the children of Colonia Dignidad, and Schaefer was called permanent uncle. By the age of 7, the children were not sent to school, but to work in the camp, doing hard fieldwork labor 7 days a week, from early in the morning to late at night. The workday for everyone 7 and older was about 16 hours a day, every day of the year. The children were given little food, offered little sleep, and those who failed to obey were beaten, locked up, or given other punishments that were even worse. The adults and children worked on the farm as slaves, never earning anything in compensation for themselves. And Schaefer used the proceeds from the agriculture and the other industries produced by the colony, which by the late 1970s was a massive production, to buy more land and to further secure it. Schaefer was looked up to as a god by the community, allowing him to do as he pleased with both adults and children. Schaefer was free to conduct countless acts of abuse, molestation, and rape dozens and dozens of children in the commune. Lawyer Hernan Fernandez, who represented several families who lived under the atrocities of Paul Schaefer in Dignidad, said, quote, "The sexual abuse of the children in Colonia Dignidad was a ritualized, organized, and perfected practice. A pedophile's paradise with children that did not have the help or protection, because in Colonia Dignidad, families did not exist. There were no parents or anyone who could help them." End quote. Schaefer was a serial abuser, abusing 3 to 4 young boys a day. Those who did not subject themselves to Schaefer willingly were tortured and subject to other experiments intended to suppress sexual instinct, using electroshock on various parts of the body, including genitals and head. Schaefer was determined to separate males and females in adults, too. Sexual intercourse was forbidden, except apparently unless Schaefer himself wanted to abuse a victim. According to Peter Levanda's Unholy Alliance book, quote, "Since sex is prohibited, the only way the colony has been able to increase its population has been by importing children from Germany. The German authorities have been investigating charges that 30 to 40 children were reported missing from the Bonn and Cologne areas have wound up at the colony. Thus, charges of both child abuse and international child abduction have been leveled at this remote cult community by eyewitnesses, escapees, and responsible members of the West German and Chilean governments." End quote. It's also reported that Schaefer and the leaders of the colony abducted local Chilean children to feed Schaefer's supply of boys. The abuse and psychological impact of those living within the colony was almost unimaginable. Schaefer created a cycle of abuse where those who were victims became abusers themselves, helping to reinforce the behavior. Members of Schaefer's congregation confessed their sins to not just Schaefer, but in public religious worship, and the permanent uncle was the judge, jury, and executioner, beating his flock. Then he encouraged his members to beat one another, adults and children alike. He and his leaders would torture his flock of followers with cattle prods brought from Germany. The hospital, which operated as a free clinic to the outside community 2 days a week, was used as a way to obtain drugs, which Schaefer then used to drug and subdue those who objected the conditions of the colony. In particular, Schaefer used psychotropic drugs that would normally treat epilepsy and schizophrenia, and had a mind-numbing effect. Germany's former ambassador to Chile, Horst Kulak-Ublick, was one of the few people who were allowed inside the colony. He was interviewed by a Chilean newspaper about his visit and said, quote, "The people inside the colony are simple, industrious people, most of them farmers from Bavaria. My impression was that they were all hypnotized under the command of one person, Paul Schaefer. The answers we received were completely monotone. Always the same." End quote. The drugs, the torture, the communication systems, barbed wires, tripwires, watchtowers, and guard stations served both Schaefer's sexual perversions and the military dictatorship of Pinochet. The familiar Nazi methods of torture Schaefer used on his own colony members to control were deployed against left-wing liberal supporters. according to a UN report from October of 1976 on the situation in Colonia Dignidad, said, quote, "The detainees' heads are covered with leather hoods, which are unstuck to their faces with substances that are supposedly chemicals. In these underground cells, interrogations are carried out through electronic equipment, including loudspeakers and microphones, while detainees are tied naked to metal frames to receive electric shocks." End quote. The potato cellar earned a dangerous reputation as the place where people were beaten and tortured to death. Whether victims were members of Schaefer's own flock or they were declared enemies of the state, people just disappeared. It's quite shocking that the UN and Amnesty International were at least somewhat aware of the things going on within the barbed perimeter fence as early as the mid-70s, in the heyday of Pinochet's reign of terror and the height of Schaefer's congregation, and yet both still operated for decades longer. Only a handful of people ever made it out of the colony alive. The landscape and security made it nearly impossible to escape. And if you went to the wrong embassy or police upon that escape, you'd likely be sent back to the camp. In the late 1980s, 2 of Schaefer's followers managed to flee Colonia Dignidad and spoke of the horrors of slavery and violence. Schaefer's right-hand man, Harmut Hoppe, had to travel to Bonn, Germany to testify against these accusations. Hoppe said then that Colonia Dignidad was one big family, with no divorce or suicide, and that its members were free to leave whenever they pleased. Hoppe said, quote, "Despite that, there have always been people or groups who have slandered our society or individual members in an incredibly scandalous way by feeding misinformation to the press." End quote. But with a community aging, the population was dwindling, and with a low birth rate, Schaefer's supply of young boys to abuse dwindled also. So Schaefer made the bold move to open Colonia Dignidad's doors a little wider to the rural surrounding community, trying to maintain the facade of a perfect agricultural haven to the outside still. But the move took place right around the same time when Schaefer's biggest ally was also removed from power. In 1995, a young boy in the local Chilean community told his mother that he was raped by Schaefer, and the mother traveled all the way to Santiago, about 4 hours away, to report the incident, rather than trusting the local police. Because by this time Pinochet was no longer in power, and the mutual protections provided to and by the colony had dissolved, the newly elected democratic government was ready to take on the Nazi cult led by Paul Schaefer. It was democracy, not communism as the Nazis always feared, that helped dismantle the control so closely held by Paul Schaefer. And like he did 40 years before, Schaefer escaped.